Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. Today's presentation is by our Frieda L. Miller Fellow Brodwyn Fischer, who is a professor of Brazilian and Latin American history at the University of Chicago. Though Brody is primarily a historian of urban inequality, her work lies at the juncture of numerous fields. Her resulting interdisciplinary research illuminates a new understanding of the presence and persistence of social and racial inequality in Brazil. Over the past three decades, Brody has authored or co-authored 3 books that span across Brazil and Latin America. 2 of these volumes detail histories of cities that are built outside of the boundaries of legal and bureaucratic regulation. And the 3rd explore cutting-edge Brazilian scholarship on the socio-legal history of slavery and abolition. In all her work, Brodwyn emphasizes informal relational dynamics that are often ignored in studies about the causes and consequences of global inequality. During her year at Radcliffe, Brody is writing a book called Intimate Inequalities. In this project, she uses informality as a framework to interrogate the relational power that sustains racialized governance and long-standing inequalities in Brazil. More specifically, she explores the ways in which informality, which shaped Brazil's society during slavery, continued to prevail in Brazil in the 20th century social and economic landscape. The book is centered on the way residents of Recife, Brazil, both experience and shape the transformation from a slave city to an informal city. Grounded in a deep evaluation of judicial records, print sources, and civic records, as well as a range of other sources from photography to cinema to oral history, her research foregrounds the historical force of the stories of those who have often been rendered invisible. Even though her findings are only sometimes uplifting, Brody is rarely happier than when she is immersed in old documents, discovering how small stories can teach us to see history with new eyes. She first discovered that joy as a first-year college student in the 1980s, right here at the Schlesinger Library. Other bright spots in her life are her family and the chances that life gives her to spend time in Brazil and Mexico. I'm delighted to give the floor to Brody.
All right, thank you so much to Claudia and also to everybody that's here, especially to the Radcliffe staff and to this year's fellows. You have really filled this year with light, and I'm never going to forget it. All right, I'm going to start today with a simple story. It's Christmas Day, 1870, and a young man named Elias José de Araújo is outside in the summer heat. It's summer at Christmas time because we're in the southern hemisphere. The place is an equatorial port city. You can see a map right here. And it's right on the state of Pernambuco in Brazil, right at the place where Brazil juts east toward Africa. So right around here. Elias was near his home in a port neighborhood called Santo Amaro. At the time, the place was a swampy no man's land. There were a few streets, a 16th century chapel, 2 cemeteries, a beggar's asylum, and a leper colony. There was a factory, some small workshops, some modest houses. And there were also clusters of huts called mocambos, occupied mostly by people trying to build a free urban life in the shadow of slavery. But Elias wasn't one of them. He was likely Afro-descendant, but he'd probably been born free, and he lived in a simple room built by his boss in the shipyard where he worked. Elias was young, maybe in his early 20s, and he would have spoken Portuguese with an accent from his native Paraíba, a poor rural state just north of Pernambuco. He didn't have family in Recife, and on that Christmas day, Elias might have been hung over. Maybe he was still celebrating Christmas Eve. But in any case, a policeman somehow noticed him on the street, arrested him for bad behavior, and threw him in the local jail. And that is when Elias's luck really went south, because it turned out that Brazil had a law that allowed a police chief, completely arbitrarily, to send anyone he deemed unruly or vagrant straight to the Brazilian army. The term was 9 years, and it probably sounded like a death sentence. There was no trial, and there was no appeal. This was a policy designed on the assumption that men like Elias could just be thrown away. Except that this time they were wrong. Because as it turns out, Elias was somebody's nobody. Francisco Gomes Saraiva, the owner of the shipyard where Elias worked, cared about him, not least because he depended on Elias's skills as a naval carpenter. Francisco wrote a letter to the president of Pernambuco province, begging for Elias's release. He followed that long letter with an even longer petition. It was signed by more than 40 principal residents and property owners, qualified and dignified people who guaranteed Elias's hard work and good character. Part of Francisco's argument involved Elias's value as a worker in a strategic industry, but even more of it revolved around Elias's loyalty, his trustworthiness, and his diligence. What Francisco asked for was not legal recourse, but rather the president's own personal grace. And that's what he got. Certainly worse for the wearer, but free. Elias left prison and went back to the shipyard on January 4th. 2 years later, Elias was married in a church wedding, and then his trail goes cold. As archival stories go, this is a pretty simple one. 8 pages, 11 days, and the story might seem insignificant. A guy we don't know much about was arrested, sent to the army, and then bailed out by his boss. What's the big deal? Yet there's something there. If we think on it a minute, there are catches. There are things that need unraveling. Why was Brazil's army recruitment law so broad and arbitrary? Why was Elias's way out a personal plea from his employer rather than a legal hearing? Why were the petition's strongest arguments about loyalty and trustworthiness and grace? And at the end of this small sequence, what did Elias owe Francisco? And what did Francisco owe the president? And how would those debts be extracted? The book I'm writing at Radcliffe this year, called Intimate Inequalities, revolves around these kinds of questions. The idea is that stories like Elias's, multiplied by many hundreds, lead to questions that have a lot to tell us about a particular mode of power, a mode of power that is informal, relational, and always just below the surface of daily life, and a mode of power that stands out because it operates both as a form of liberation and as a form of structural oppression. Intimate Inequalities makes the case that this kind of informal relational power has a lot to teach us about inequality and its persistence, and especially about how inequalities rooted in slavery continue to thrive in times of freedom. Now, I don't have much time today, and my book is really long, and so instead of summarizing it, I'm going to focus on methods and concepts and stories. First, I'm going to take a wide lens, and I'm going to share a few thoughts about history as a field and about my practice within it. Second, I'm going to give you a down and dirty overview of Brazilian slavery and introduce you just a little bit more to Recife. And finally, I'm going to give you a brief archival tour. So let's start with the wide lens. Claudia called me a historian. So what's that? The only thing that really unifies historians, as far as I can tell, is that we care about the past. and that's not really much to go on. So maybe there's a smaller wide lens. What kind of historian am I? If this were a game of free association, I'd answer with a string of words: archives, disruptions, stories. An archive is just a collection of sources that give us information about the past. Historical archives are usually a collection of old papers, but they can also contain material objects, sounds, images, oral histories, you name it. But archive is also a vexed concept. And there's a lot of well-founded skepticism about archives as sources of knowledge. Anthropologists, literary critics, and post-colonial scholars have all pointed out that historical archives are usually created by power, and that as a result, historical archives are full of distortions and silences and silencings that structure and warp what we think we know about the past. And my response to all of that as a historian is mainly just yes. Archival information is pretty worthless if you don't know who produced it, how, by which rules and logics, and for what purpose. Reading any archive well requires enormous amounts of skepticism and cross-referencing and critical thinking. And a document's meaning is only sometimes in the things that it actually says. Most of the time, what is missing from an archive is more important than what it actually contains. But my yes response is also a yes and. With all of those caveats, I still think archives have unique power. Part of the pull is that historical archives, no matter who put them together, freeze in time stories and secrets that they didn't mean to tell. And as someone who loves a good mystery and who thinks that everyday stories are the building blocks of life, there is nothing like the thrill of piecing together archival fragments and discovering a life that changes the way that we think about the past. But the most unique aspect of historical archives is not just the stories that they lead us to, but also those stories' capacity to disrupt us. I don't remember at all the archival moments that just confirm what I already thought I knew. What stand out are the moments when I just cannot understand what I've found. When I don't understand the logic, when I don't understand the outcome, when I realize that my frameworks are just not enough to interpret what I have in my hands. And that's the point when archival stories can force us to shift the scripts that we use to explain the past. And that's also the point when archival stories can blow our minds. So in some ways, this is all you need to know about my practice of history. I find it weirdly thrilling to be confused by stories hidden deep in archives. But archival history can't really be done if it's not rooted in a place and time, and it doesn't have very much meaning if there aren't good questions behind it. And so the places I root my work have always been cities in Latin America and especially in Brazil, and I can talk a little bit more about that later if you'd like. And my questions have usually come back to the same stem. Why is social and racial inequality so persistent, even in the face of pretty radical transformations in institutions and laws? I want to know how inequality looks different if we pay less attention to how systems and structures and social movements are represented, and more to how people make and use them in their everyday life. I want to know how laws and institutions shape inequality, not just through what they explicitly do, but also through who and what they exclude. And I want to know how inequality is shaped by connection as well as opposition. I love a good face-off between the underdogs and the powerful as much as anybody, but I think there's also, whether we want to recognize it or not, a lot of explanatory power in the ways that all kinds of people create, sustain, and use vertical and hierarchical relationships. So that group of questions has led me in many directions, but the problem space I've worked in most often involves something that scholars call informality. What, you might ask, is informality? It's a complicated word, but for my purposes, the meaning is pretty simple. Informality is any way of doing things, mostly ordinary things, that happens outside the restrictions and the protections of state law and state institutions. By this definition, the concept of informality gives us a lens to explore the whole universe of power that is often created by law, but operates outside of its grasp. Anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, architects, cultural studies scholars, and artists often feel pretty comfortable in the realm of informality. But we historians, bound by paper archives and rigid scripts, mostly don't. And that has impoverished both our understanding of informality and our understanding of history. I've written about informality in relation to 20th century legal change, popular social movements, and urban racial inequalities. But I've written especially about something called informal urbanism, the ways that people, and especially poor people, create and claim urban space outside the limits of state law. And that work has led me to two issues that are at the very center of my current work on intimate inequalities. The first involves how powerful people use their ability to shape the law to create informality. Powerful people create informality. By writing laws that they have no intention or capacity to enforce universally, like the recruitment law that trapped Elias, authorities essentially license themselves to decide who will be held to the law and who will be exempted. This is a particular kind of power, the power to grant grace, the power to apply the law without the logics of citizenship, and its net effect does a lot to kill the emancipatory possibilities of liberal democracy. The second issue is really a paradox that grows from the first. Informality is powerful and resistant because it's a way for marginalized people to build their lives, individually and collectively. Brazil's favelas and peripheries, where millions of people have staked out their own right to the city, are a case in point. But informality is also part of a durable structure of power that systematically deprives certain people of citizenship, protection, and resources. And that is why those same informal urban spaces that regular people struggle so hard to build and so hard to defend also, at the same time, tend to fortify the deep infrastructure of urban, racial, and social inequality. So, the point of my book is to connect all of those complicated issues to one of Brazil's defining historical processes, the history of slavery and abolition. For people who know Brazil, the idea of connecting slavery and informality will seem pretty logical. But for those of you who know slavery mainly through a US lens, here's just a little bit of background. I'll begin with a number, 5 million. That is how many enslaved Africans arrived alive on Brazilian shores between the 16th and the 19th century, 5 million. That is, for reference, more than 10 times the number who were brought as slaves to what is now the United States. And it's 40 to 50% of all enslaved people who were brought to the Americas. And this chart gives you some idea. This is one reason that Brazil now has the second largest black population in the world, after Nigeria. Now, in some ways, all American slaveries are the same. They're violent, they're deadly, they're revolting. But they didn't all function exactly the same way. And one distinctive element of Brazilian slavery was the possibility of manumission and self-purchase, which were used as methods of slave discipline. Basically, enslavers allowed people to construct rickety ladders that could end in freedom for a tiny number of people. The possibility of freedom, the thinking went, would snuff out rebellion and keep the system as a whole intact. But there were some unintended consequences even beyond rebellion. By the mid-19th century, Brazil had a majority black population. Black people were the majority of the free population, and there were more black Brazilians who were free than were enslaved. All of that obviously had important consequences for the history of race and racism in Brazil. Another related difference had to do with the slave trade and the law. In 1831, under British pressure, Brazil legally banned the slave trade, just as its slave labor-driven coffee economy began to take off. The solution found by labor-hungry enslavers, who were also the statesmen of independent Brazil, was to massively violate their own laws. And all told, Brazil's complicit ruling classes illegally enslaved, by their own laws, illegally enslaved, some 700,000 Africans between the 1830s and the 1850s. 700,000 people over 20 years illegally enslaved. Brazil was finally forced to end the illegal trade in the 1850s, and after that, slavery entered into a turbulent phase involving massive displacement, grassroots revolt, and powerful abolitionist movements. But unlike the US, slavery didn't end in Brazil with a full-on civil war. Instead, social movements and the grassroots and in the public sphere undid slavery's foundations. Beginning with the Free Womb Law in 1871, legislators projected slavery's demise, and Brazilian enslavers scrambled to find new sources of labor and disinvest from their slave property. By the time Brazil became the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888, most enslaved people had their hard-won freedom. Abolition itself was just a one-line law. The only thing that it did was end formal bondage. So that's the bit about slavery. But why Recife? I'll spend just a few minutes telling you a little about the city. During the years that my study covers, 1870 to 1940, Recife was Brazil's third largest city. And before the Brazilian slave trade ended, it was also Brazil's third largest slave city. That history was the first thing that drew me to Recife. I was especially interested in Recife's role as a kind of postcard city for the myth that Brazilian society was basically a racial democracy that was shaped by intimate ties between the enslaved and their enslavers. Historians and most thinking people have completely rejected the idea that Brazil is any kind of racial democracy. But in Recife, there isn't much doubt that intimate, hierarchical relationships did a lot to sustain slavery and its afterlives, and I wanted to figure out how. The second thing that drew me to Recife were its shantytowns. By the early 1940s, Recife was sometimes called a Mucambopolis, both because the majority of its homes were these kinds of places, mocambos, and because residents of those mocambos were unusually good at claiming urban space. Finally, I was drawn to Recife because it has generated so many interesting social and political movements. These include abolitionism and shantytown mobilizations, but Recife was also a center for communists and the Catholic left, as well as the pedagogy of the oppressed, liberation theology, and the Brazilian version of rights to the city. It fascinated me that this kind of radicalism could grow in a place where hierarchical and relational power structures were also so strong. And I wanted to understand how these two things fit together. So it's probably pretty obvious that these aren't the kinds of things that would draw most people to Recife. And pausing a little on that point, I think will actually help clarify both the city and my approach. So before the internet, outsiders usually learned about Recife through travel literature or guidebooks, and those tended to fit a well-worn pattern. Most of them arrived by sea, as visitors arrived by ship, and they gave away a little disappointment. Recife's flat tidal landscapes didn't compare at all to Rio de Janeiro's mountains, and its tiny urban core seemed like a little speck compared to the surrounding expanses, which were riddled with rivers and pockmarked with sugar plantations. These tours usually then proceeded to Recife's three core neighborhoods, which were constructed in colonial times and owe their existence to Dutch waterworks. And I apologize for the quality of these maps, but you can see right here the central area of Recife, the three areas in orange. A guide might then explain how Recife's urban fabric expanded in tentacles from the tiny core connecting the downtown to far-flung neighborhoods that mostly grew around old sugar plantations. So that's one, and that's another. Tours would then take visitors back to the center and through Recife's urban landmarks. So you might see churches and plazas and seats of imperial authority. You might also see boulevards, not many of them, hospitals, prisons, parks, or theaters. You'd also see, later on, portworks and tram lines and factories. And sprinkled through all of this, at every single stage, there would be some local color. Images and descriptions of exotic local customs, religious festivals, carnival, the ritualized performance called maracatu. And as many as 200 years ago, tours often already included some literal slumming, most of it involving mocambos and their Afro-descendant residents, many of which were actually portrayed on postcards. The urban landmarks were usually presented as Recife's urban future. These were the cities linked to the modernizing scripts that were already creating global cities all around the planet. And the local color and slumming were usually presented as just the opposite, as exotic, problematic bits of the past, not the essence of the city, but exceptions to it. What you would never see on a tour is that the actual situation was inverted. Recife as a whole was just like this photo of a beachside neighborhood that would become a real estate bonanza. The European-style street with its church and modest houses is just a tiny facade, overwhelmed by the much larger Mocambopolis that surrounds it. Now, some urban histories look a lot like these tours. If I were to follow that mold, I would take you straight to those parts of Recife's history that look like the history of Paris or Rome or London or Chicago. There would be Parisian-style urban reforms, fascist-style urban populism, English-style makings of the working class, Chicago-style commodity capitalism. And you'd learn the parts of Recife's history that don't fit those molds are kind of like slumming. They're exceptional, they're deviant, they're curious, but they're not a part of urban history. They are instead what drags it down and what makes Recife into a so-called underdeveloped urban space. Luckily for me, Recife's history has diverged so much and so often from those hyper-real urban scripts that I've had a lot of brilliant scholarship and sources to work with in patching together a really different kind of ramble through this city of Recife between 1870 and 1940. And that's where I'd like to take you now. So, me being me, and also Recife being Recife, our first stop is going to be in the archives. And I would love to take you to all of them, but I'll choose just one. The incredible Memorial da Justiça, which preserves Pernambuco's judicial records. It's located in an old railway station in central Recife, in an area that used to be filled with tenements and brothels and mocambos. Now it sits next to a cookie factory, so I associate this place with the smell of cookies. The Memorial is better indexed than some other archives in Recife, all of which work in really precarious conditions. The documents are in numbered boxes, separated by time period and by the kinds of judicial documents that they contain. And in my research at the Memorial, I mainly ordered court cases. And this is more or less what they look like: scrawled, worm-eaten, sometimes hundreds of pages long. But if I can manage to read them, and that is a pretty big if, the payoff can be huge. And that's because these court cases aren't like their Anglo counterparts. Brazil's civil law system required a full written record of every single event that was pertinent to a case. Which means that in the middle of all of the lying and all of the silencing and all of the distortion that is produced by all court records, we also find elaborate storytelling. We find it in what victims and perpetrators and witnesses say about the details of everyday life. We find it in their social and moral logics, and we find it in their alliances and in their divisions. Historians all over the civil law world discovered this a long time ago, And scholars like Sadia Hartman and Rashana Johnson and Marisa Fuentes have used different kinds of documents for similar ends in the United States and the English-speaking Caribbean. But there's something special about how Brazilian historians of slavery and abolition have used these sources. Over 50 years, led by people like Harvard's own Sidney Chalubi, thousands of researchers have unearthed and decoded these documents in archives from the Amazon to Brazil's southern borders. And that has completely transformed the historiography of Brazilian slavery. In a country with virtually no firsthand narratives of slavery that were written by people who actually experienced it, these documents have allowed historians, many of whom I should say are themselves the descendants of enslaved people, to reconstruct the lives and the logics and the strategies and the struggles of individuals and families and communities all across Brazil and across the Atlantic world. I could gush for hours about this work, but what matters here is that the collective project has developed a set of techniques for extracting stories that has really informed my work in Recife. It begins with a simple read. What do the documents say? Once we have that, maybe it's about an enslaved person who runs away, maybe it involves a girl's deflowerment, maybe it's just a bar fight. Then we can begin to pull at the loose threads. The most important tool we have for this is cross-referencing. Using digital newspaper databases, vital records, other researchers' work, and adjacent primary documents, we can often trace the larger stories behind each place and each character and each event that's central to a single case. This technique doesn't always yield all that much. Sometimes, after days of hard work, all you have is a teeny tiny bit of insight. But if we get enough of these small insights, they work something like a photo mosaic. You'll see the documents on this side, the face on the other. And if we have just a little luck, in some cases, we can even go further. We can piece together multi-generational trajectories of individuals and families and communities that allow us to understand something about the experience of slavery and post-emancipation from the inside out. So at this point, half blind from squinting at bad handwriting, minds reeling from way too much information, we've really succeeded in getting these very noisy archives to tell us something about logics of daily life and about subjectivities and about how ordinary people interact with power and with history. Okay, so from the archives, let's move to stories. The ones I've collected for Intimate Inequalities span 70 years and Recife's entire big municipal geography. They happen in townhouses and on rural plantations. They happen in runaway maroon hideouts and established Mocambo communities, and they happen inside tenements and on city streets. And these stories present us again and again with sources of confusion and surprise. There are enslaved people who seek police protection, and there are free people who actually claim to be enslaved to escape police brutality. There's an enslaved woman who gives a free servant helps a free servant girl give birth and then rescues that same baby from natal alienation. But then there's also an enslaved boy who's forced to be complicit in the murder of the free girl he serves with. People who were once enslaved become enslavers. Abolitionists own slaves and block freedom. There's a maroon hideout infiltrated by a black bounty hunter. There's a girl who's born white but racialized as black when she tries to marry a rich boy. There's a rich man who's intimately familiar with the winding geography of a tiny shantytown. There are Afro-Brazilian religious spaces that are protected by white Catholics, and there are plenty of communists who call on capitalists for protection. There's one shantytown, my favorite, where a boy makes a living by building homemade radios so that residents with no electricity can hear the latest sambas from Rio. And there's another shantytown, not my favorite, that is governed as a personal fiefdom by a man who even prints out his own little constitution to govern local life. So behind each of these surprises lies a question, and those questions structure my larger story. It's a story about how relational power generates both freedom and inequality. And it's a story about how people use intimate bonds to forge their own histories. Our archival tour will end with one last example. This story's protagonist is a 22-year-old mother of two named Catarina. She sued for her freedom in a Recife court in 1884. Freedom suits were common. They were part of an abolitionist legal strategy. And this one ran 175 pages. It was hard to decipher, and it was harder still to take, because on first gloss, it tells a story of freedom thwarted. Catarina was born in the early 1860s in a rural area of Recife that's circled on the map called Várzea. She was daughter to a man named Gregorio and a woman named Negina. Her African maternal grandmother, named Maria do O, was probably illegally enslaved. Catarina had two younger siblings, Flora and Manuel. Maria do O had been enslaved, so that was the family tree, this is the enslavement tree. Maria do O had been enslaved by one of Recife's most important sugar families in a place that probably looked something like this. Her enslaver, named Maria Matilde, everybody's Maria in this story, had sent Nedina to work for her goddaughter, who was named Maria Eugenia, in the mid-1850s. So you can see Maria Eugenia on the chart right here. Maria Matilde, that original enslaver, eventually freed Maria do O, and in 1871, when she died, she also freed all of her 17 remaining slaves. But in 1872, her goddaughter Maria Eugenia registered Nedina, Catarina, and Catarina's siblings as her slaves. She then sold Catarina to a Portuguese-born textile entrepreneur named Aurelio. This is Aurelio, who had a business that was close to Maria Eugenia's family, and he also lived nearby in a place called Apipucos. And this is also, by the way, where Gilberto Freire is from, for those of you that know his work. It isn't really clear what Aurelio's intentions were. He enslaved 8 other people, most of them were women, and he seems to have forced them to labor as domestic servants and seamstresses, but it's also possible that he forced them into sex work. I don't quite have a clear picture on that one. Sometime after she was sold, Catarina gave birth to a daughter, and 3 years later, another newborn daughter, we don't know their names, was taken from Catarina. Why, we do not know. Catarina, when the baby was taken, made a special mark on that daughter's skin so that she could later be recognized and retrieved from Recife's foundling home. Catarina did everything that she could to escape Aurelio. She asked the abolitionist who rented her enslaved sister to buy her. She asked Maria Matilde's son-in-law, Ignacio, to help her raise cash or to find an abolitionist lawyer. When that failed, she ran away to Ignacio's family home in downtown Recife. It was only when a bounty hunter found her there that she decided to fight for her freedom in the courts. A judge accepted the case and placed Catarina in one of her daughters in Ignacio's custody, where she worked until the case played out. Now, on the face of it, Catarina had a pretty good argument. She said that Maria Matilde, her grandmother's illiterate enslaver, had passed Catarina's mother Nedina to Maria Eugenia, so this transfer right here, not as a slave, but as a kind of indentured servant. Ignacio, Catherine's protector, who had also been Maria Matilde's son-in-law, all these people are connected, confirmed this, and he also said that Maria Matilde had stated repeatedly that Nedina was free because her African mother had been illegally enslaved. Another witness, named Lucas Joaquim, himself an African-born freedman who had been enslaved by Maria Matilde's family, had known Maria do O and still lived on Maria Matilde's lands. These are a lot of names. He said that he had overheard, and this is really important, Lucas Joaquim, the person who had been enslaved from Africa, he said that he overheard kitchen table conversations in which Maria Matilde insisted that the whole family was free. So the owner insisted that the family was free. Through some combination then of Black solidarity and patriarchal sympathy, it looked for a little while like Caterina might just go free. And yet then, as so often happened, the case fell apart. A man Caterina trusted, someone who would later make a huge public show of his abolitionism, took the side of her enslaver. Aurelio produced a mountain of paper, some of it probably forged, that the judge gave far greater weight to than he did to Ignacio or Lucas Joaquim's verbal testimony. Caterina's last two witnesses, one of whom was probably her father, never testified. And the judge summarily closed the trial without even allowing for closing arguments. He ruled against Caterina, and in 1885, she lost her final appeal. At this point, Caterina's own trail goes cold. But even as Caterina was losing her freedom, the rest of her family was freed. And the story of how that happened should give us one last pause. Officially, the family benefited from an emancipation fund that had been created by the Free Womb Law of 1871. But that fund was underfunded, and the decision about who would be freed was personal and contentious. Maria Eugenia probably hustled to get Caterina's family on that list. And the reason wasn't charity. The fund paid good, hard public cash at inflated prices. When Nedina and her children gained their freedom, it may not have even come with the clothes on their backs. But when Maria Eugenia gave that freedom, she received a substantial bit of public capital. Still, even so, this was a triumph. By 1885, Caterina was the only person in this family tree who was still enslaved. So this is a story with a lot of catches. There are fragments here that take us back to the heart of Black resistance. Lucas Joaquim's careful cataloging of overheard conversations, the knowledge networks that led Caterina to mark her baby daughter's skin, the possibility that Ignacio's home was a safe house in an urban underground railroad. There are also so many elements in this case that show us elite capacity for betrayal and hypocrisy, which makes it even more dispiriting that at the end of the day, Caterina and her family still called so often on freedom strategies that tangled them in relational hierarchies that had been created by their enslavers. Why? These are patterns that span across hundreds of cases and many decades. And that should tell us something. Caterina and her family had their reasons. And if we want to really get at the role that people like them played in their own history, we need to pay more attention to what those reasons were. Maybe the first step is thinking hard about what this family wanted. A few things come to mind. They wanted to be free, they wanted a roof over their head and resources to live, and they also really wanted to stay close to each other. The city they lived in made it really hard to do those things without help from more powerful people. Their friends and their family were still enslaved. Their access to land and work was mediated by slave owners, who were all networked with one another. And freedom was precarious. Black people could be re-enslaved if they didn't have a protector, and even free people could be abused, recruited to the army, or worse. Institutions and laws didn't work without personal connections, and relational power greased every single wheel. So it's fair to assume that Caterina and her family weren't stupid. They knew their enslavers' hypocrisies, and they probably understood very well just what favors cost. But maybe the stakes were sometimes just too high to care. Maybe Caterina and her family just wanted to live together. Maybe their vision looked something like this, or maybe it looked something like this. Maybe that was a lot better than what had come before, and maybe their great-grandchildren were able to turn those beginnings into this community, which was built from Mocambos through social struggle, or this one. When we look as outsiders at these kinds of lives and these kinds of communities that were built in freedom, we might mainly see the afterlives of slavery, the inequality, the poverty, the violence that relational power sustains. But it's worth thinking about the fact that the people who built those lives might have had a really different view of change over time, one that sees each life building on whatever the previous one could manage. and one that recognizes social transformation in the aggregation of all of those small moves forward. This is the kind of mosaic of historical change that people like Katerina and her family created. And if we look at it closely enough, we might just find some new ways of thinking about the limits of freedom and also about the possibilities of social change. Thank you.
Stories. There is a lot of interest about Katerina's daughters and where they were found, if they were ever found.
Sure, sure. So this is one of these things that's sort of a loose thread in the case. What we know is that the daughter was first taken away from Katerina at birth, and the person who tells this story is the abolitionist that betrays her. So he was a family friend. He was the one. Katerina's sister was enslaved to Maria Eugenia, but Maria Eugenia sent her as a slave for rent to work in the home of this abolitionist, right? So this was somebody that knows both families well and who Katerina really trusted. So he tells the story of this baby. And when he says it, he says that he tells the story as if it were Katerina that wanted the baby to be alienated from her, to be brought away, that she didn't want to be near the baby, which isn't impossible because the baby might have been born of a rape. There are all kinds of ways of sort of thinking about it. But the things that make me think that that's not true are, number one, that legally, if they had separated her from her baby, that would have been illegal, and so it would have been a grounds for more legal action. And the other thing is that Katerina makes this mark on the baby so that she can be found. And so after that, there's some kind of hullabaloo that we don't know about, and the family actually ends up retrieving the baby, but they don't allow her to live with Katerina. They send her to a nearby house to be raised by another family as this kind of shadowy figure that's sort of halfway between a really subordinate family member and a servant. And Brazilian families raise these kinds of kids a lot. And so she was brought to this house, but we know that Katerina visited her pretty much every day. And so there was obviously a bond between her and this child. And that's probably one of the reasons that she wouldn't have wanted to just run away to another city, because she has these two children that she has to deal with.
The next question connects your arguments about informality with carnival. Is there a connection between the informality and the rise of carnival in Recife, which is very popular among the poor urban population?
Sure. So this isn't something, there are other people that do really fantastic work on this, so this isn't something that I've ever researched, but the connection with the things that I talk about here is that there are a couple different kinds of carnival, and they take precedence at different times in Recife's history. But the origins of the popular carnival have a lot to do with the history that I showed you the picture of earlier, this thing called maracatu, and then there are all kinds of other forms of Afro-Brazilian music and celebration. And those went through phases where they were really persecuted. And so as late as the 1930s, for example, there was a really big campaign against these things. But that was even the decade when these began to be tourist attractions and began to be something that outsiders were looking at. So there was always a lot of very conflictual history about the meaning of those celebrations. And at first, elites sort of thought that there was something degrading about them, that they weren't sophisticated, they weren't European, whatever. But then they realized that Brazil could sort of sell this as their own sort of unique contribution to the world. And then they all started saying, well, of course, I know about that, and I know, that kind of appropriation. But the way that this connects back to these stories is that during the years where there was legal prosecution, one of the things that other researchers have found and that I've found is that most of the places where all kinds of Afro-Brazilian music and religion were practiced, they were very much autonomous spaces, and they were very much places where people kept alive their own ideas about spirituality and their own culture, and they were linked to their own family. But many of them, I would say even most of them that I've been able to find out something, also knew that they had to be protected by somebody because they could be persecuted by the police. And so it was really important to them to have people who were associated with these rituals, with these practices, that were part of the white world of power, because that was how they could maintain those spaces of autonomy. So that's kind of the connection over the long run, I think.
Yeah. And staying always with the informality aspects of the talk, are there instances where informality generated institutional and legal reforms?
Yeah, so the earliest movements for this are actually, some of them are in Recife, and so there's a community called São Miguel, which incorporated an actual legal neighborhood association. I think the date was in the late 1920s. And you can actually still go to this place and see the house with the name of the association there. It's sort of endured and gone through a lot of different mutations over time. But as early as that, you had both residents and also sort of ironically communist activists who really got involved in trying to find a way to establish legal property rights for people who live in these kinds of places. So my first book, A Poverty of Rights, was actually about that process in Rio. And I think the thing that I'll go to after I finish this book is going to be about how it is that in the late 20th century, a lot of those struggles that had already gone on over 50 or 60 years ended up creating this legal structure that actually, in theory, should legalize a lot of the land that was sort of claimed by people as their own. The problem, of course, is that the legal system is not any more uniformly applied with those laws than it is with any other ones, and so those laws have ended up creating other kinds of informality. But really, there's a way of thinking about what's happened, not just in Brazil, all over Latin America and all over the world, that this is kind of the greatest land reform that most of these countries, Brazil has never had a major land reform, and this is one of the greatest ones that the country's ever experienced, because really poor people have a place to live, oftentimes on really desirable land, so there's a lot of connections.
And is informality and the way it shapes power unique to Brazil, or we can extend that to other places in Latin America and even in the US?
Sure. So I think about this project as, it's sort of like a script, right? I talked a few times in the talk about this idea of scripts, that I think historians, whether we know it or not, we're always thinking about these scripts of histories that we've read in other places, these ideas of sort of how time passes and what sort of happens over time. And the problem, and my Chicago colleague Dipesh Chakrabarty has written about this more than anybody else for a general audience, I think. The problem with that is that most of those scripts are coming from Europe and the North Atlantic. And so we just think that every history ought to sort of repeat those histories. So the history of Paris in Mumbai, right? That's kind of the way that a lot of history gets written. And the idea of this project is that I want to be able to write a kind of script that will stick in people's heads like that, because we can't get rid of those scripts, they're always there. But to write a script that will also travel, and so that people will look at Recife's history and they'll say, wait a minute, I recognize bits and pieces of that, right? And in the United States, I think the place where we can see it most clearly and most dramatically is even if you take more than a cursory glance at the immigration history of this country. That we create laws that the people who wrote them knew were not going to be enforced universally, and we use those to create a kind of power that can be wielded against the laborers who are undocumented in the United States, and also against workers who are documented in the United States by bringing down their wages, and all of that to benefit all of us as consumers, right? So if we're looking for informality in the United States, we don't have to go any further than that. It's a perfect example of how these kinds of things are done.
Moving on to a question about religion and abolitionism. Could you talk about the role of religion in the abolitionist struggles within this particular period?
It's a complicated question, and I would actually say that I'm not the right person to ask, because there are a lot of people that have done a lot deeper research than I have. So what I'm telling you is just things that I've read in other people's books. But I guess I would say a couple of things. I mean, first of all, the Catholic Church had a really complicated relationship with slavery itself. And so one of the places where Black and enslaved people were most effectively able to organize, and actually, ironically, sometimes the places that would best protect Afro-Brazilian religious life were in brotherhoods that were created within the Catholic Church, right? So there's that side of the history that has to do with the church creating a space for a certain kind of Black solidarity. But then the church was also really complicit in all kinds of other aspects of slavery. And so they would allow somebody to record somebody as enslaved in civil records when they didn't have proof of it, or they would just do all kinds of things that would actually look the other way when horrible slave abuse was happening. They wouldn't insist that people be kept together as families. All of these kinds of things you can find as well. But then there were also members of the Catholic Church that really believed deeply in the notion that all humans were the same before God, and that really did believe in the doctrine that enslaved people were human beings that should have the sacrament and should be protected from abuse in certain ways. And so the Catholic Church could also be sort of a recourse for that. And in abolition, there was the same kind of mixture, right? There were plenty of people who were good, upstanding Catholics who were the ones that supported the structure of the Catholic Church, especially at the local level, local festivities, you know, that kind of thing. But then actually the Emperor of Brazil, there was a very famous visit to the Vatican. There were all kinds of religious sentiments that sort of informed formal abolition when it happened in the 1880s. So I guess the shortest version of the answer is that it was really varied. It certainly wasn't, I wouldn't say that it's quite the same as liberation theology in the 20th century, but it certainly was, the Catholic Church certainly was a space where sometimes people could find ways of fighting for emancipation in one way or another.
The next question is about the archives, and did you work with oral history to complement the limitations of the archives? And have you met any of the descendants of the people that you've mentioned?
Well, I've met quite a few of the descendants of the people who don't come out looking very good in my book, because they're really easy to find because they have these, you know, incredibly complicated names that they're proud of. And actually, some of them are you know, people who are completely on the other side of history at this point in their lives. So it's, you know, it's a hard connection. In terms of the people that I've traced in the archives, I don't think I've been able to meet anyone or even figure out who their descendants would be. And that's for a pretty simple reason, which is that people tend to all have the same name. And so, and the poorer you are, the more likely it is that your name is the name of 1,000 other people. And so to try to figure, so I can meet somebody who can tell me stories about their families having been enslaved. That I've certainly done. But I can't make a direct connection between those stories and the stories that I have, or at least I haven't been lucky enough to be able to do that yet. In terms of oral history, so obviously the people that I'm writing about in the 19th century died a long time ago, and so I can't really do oral history with them. And there was nothing like the WPA project that we saw a little bit of yesterday in Betsy's presentation. And so the first oral histories that you begin to have some record from, there are some from the 1930s and 40s. I haven't really, for Recife, found anything earlier than that. And then there are a lot that are recorded from about the 1960s forward. And so a lot of them, there are some recordings, and then there are also transcripts of them. Some of them are published, and so you can work a lot with those. And in my previous book, which was on a more modern period, I did do a lot of work with oral history. And what I found with it is sort of what I'm looking for when I work with oral history here. And that's that it would be asking a lot of somebody to actually have a very precise memory of things that happened a long time ago. But what you can get, even from people who were the grandchildren of people who were themselves enslaved, and those people are still alive sometimes, they actually heard it from their grandparents. What you can get is a sense of sort of the meaning that all of this had, and the frameworks and ways of thinking that led people to make the decisions that they do. And so that last little bit of the talk, when I was talking about how it is that you sort of try to imagine what it was that these people wanted and what they needed, I think that oral history can really help you a lot with that part of it. They can tell you sort of what to look for, these little tiny hints in the documents. And what you try to do is to tell a story that is going to sound true to the people that are the descendants of these kinds of people, even if you don't know literally who they are.
Yeah. Thank you. This is all we have time today. Thank you, Brody, for your wonderful presentation. I want to thank the audience for their terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe public programs. You can find more about them at radcliffe.harvard.edu and also watch videos of past events. And with that, I wish you all a great rest of the day. Thank you.